Chapter 45. Mission Completed. When the time of pilgrimage drew near, the Prophet caused it to be known all over Arabia that he intended to offer the pilgrimage. It is well known that pilgrimage to the Kaaba has always been a religious ritual ever since Prophets Abraham and Ishmael, peace be upon them, raised that construction which was, according to the Quran, the first house of worship ever to be built. Although distortion crept into the religious beliefs of the people of Arabia over the centuries, to the extent that they worshipped idols and statues in place of or in association with God, they continued to do the pilgrimage as a religious duty, albeit in a corrupted form. Many habits were included in pilgrimage which cannot be acceptable to God, to say the least. Examples of these were the fact that the Quraysh considered themselves to be privileged over all Arabs and did not share in certain parts of pilgrimage because they were exempt from them, being the custodians of the Kaaba. They also imposed on pilgrims from outside Mecca to do the tawaf either wearing garments made in Mecca or in the nude. There were other forms and traces of polytheism in the rituals offered by the Arabs in their pilgrimage before the victory of Islam. As has been seen, the Prophet had dispatched his companion Abu Bakr to put a stop to all those aspects in the preceding year. Now, it was time for the Prophet to make clear to the Muslims the duties of Islamic pilgrimage as a major act of worship which earned the pilgrim forgiveness of his or her past sins. For this reason, the Prophet caused it to be known that he welcomed anyone who wished to offer the pilgrimage with him. People started to come to Medina from all over Arabia to join in this great Islamic worship. Moreover, a pilgrimage was the one act of worship which the Muslims had not yet seen the Prophet doing. Since every act of Islamic worship serves social, national, and human purposes in addition to its spiritual and personal importance, it was necessary that the Muslims should learn how to offer pilgrimage directly from the Prophet. Furthermore, pilgrimage is an important part of the religion of Islam. Hence, the message of Islam would not have been conveyed complete unless the Prophet himself offered and taught Muslims how to offer pilgrimage. Joining the Prophet on pilgrimage. It was not surprising that people started to arrive in Medina from all over Arabia shortly after the announcement was made that the Prophet intended to offer his pilgrimage. Every day, Medina welcomed people from far and wide. Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Prophet's companion, supplied the most detailed and authentic account of the Prophet's pilgrimage. He recorded that when the procession of pilgrimage started from Medina, he could not see its end either to the front or the back, or to the right or the left. Estimates of the number of people who joined the Prophet on his trip of pilgrimage from Medina vary from 90,000 to 130,000. A similar number were waiting for him in Mecca to join him there. When the Prophet completed his preparations for his blessed journey, he left Medina at noon on Saturday, the 25th of Dhul Qa'dah in the 10th year of the Islamic calendar, which makes the Prophet's emigration to Medina its starting date. With him were all his wives and members of his household, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, as well as those who came to join him from all Arab tribes. He had with him 100 camels, which he intended to slaughter as a sacrifice. When he arrived at Dhul Hulaifa, which is now known as Abyad Ali, a place about 10 kilometers from Medina, he offered Asr prayer, shortening it to 2 rakahs, since he was traveling. He entered into the state of consecration, wearing 2 white pieces of cloth, wrapping one round his waist to cover his body from his waist to well below his knees, and throwing the other over his shoulders. He made his intention to offer the pilgrimage and the Umrah combined. That is, he chose the Qiran method of Ihram since he had brought his sacrificial animals with him. When he mounted his she-camel to resume his journey, he started repeating the following form of talbiyah. Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik. Innal hamda wal ni'mata laka wal mulk, la sharika lak. This may be translated into English as follows. I respond to your call, my Lord. I respond to you. There is no deity other than you. All praise, grace, and sovereignty belong to you. You have no partners. This epitomizes the worship of pilgrimage, which enhances the notion of total submission to God and dedication to His cause. All the Muslims repeated the same sentences, asserting their submission and dedication to God. All the people in that noble procession were yearning to see the Kaaba and offer pilgrimage pure and complete in the Islamic way. Every time they had to go uphill or descend a valley and camp for rest or prayer, and every time a change of scene took place, they repeated that form of talbiyah which asserted their total belief in the oneness of God. The noble procession continued its peaceful march. It was a procession which spread a feeling of security and reassurance to all around it. Its slogan was one of peace and security. Not a single person in that procession harbored any ill feelings towards anyone. None of them carried a weapon of any sort. None harmed an animal, frightened a bird, cut down a tree, or destroyed any plant. It was, in short, a procession of love. It was a peaceful march of a peaceful procession which spread a feeling of kindness, peace, and security all around. Everywhere, animals, birds, and trees were at peace. The procession was at peace with all people and with all creatures. Its objective was one of love and solidarity. Its mark was one of true brotherhood and absolute equality. No worldly considerations distinguished any group in that procession over any other group. It was a dedicated procession in which there was no place for carnal desires, futile arguments, social distinction, or quarreling. It was a demonstration of love and brotherhood established on the solid basis of fearing to incur God's anger and seeking to earn His pleasure. The journey took several days. The procession arrived in Makkah at sunset of the 4th day of Dhul Hijjah. The Prophet stayed the night at Dutuwa, on the outskirts of Makkah. In the morning he had a bath and entered Makkah in daylight. When the Prophet arrived at the Kaaba and saw the holy place, he lifted his hands and prayed to God to multiply the honor and sanctity of the house and to honor and reward everyone who honors the house by offering pilgrimage or umrah. The Prophet entered the mosque and began his tawaf round the Kaaba, mounted on his she-camel. When he had finished his tawaf, he offered a prayer of 2 rakahs behind the position known as Maqam Ibrahim. Mounting his she-camel, he then proceeded to do the walk, sa'i, between the 2 hills of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa. When he had finished that, he gave his orders to the Muslims with him who had not brought their sacrificial animals with them to release themselves from consecration or ihram until the time for pilgrimage was due. The Prophet and his companions stayed in Makkah until the 8th of Dhul Hijjah, the time when the duties of the pilgrimage were due. It is not our intention to give a detailed account of how the Prophet offered every duty of pilgrimage. That is more of a specialized study. The task of the biographer is to relate every major event in the life of the person whose biography he is writing to the main line of his life and the goals he sets out to achieve. He needs only to concentrate on those details which influence his decisions in major events. In the case of the Prophet, however, every detail is important. Since pilgrimage is a main act of worship, the way the Prophet did every detail of its forms part of his guidance and should therefore be recorded and studied. The place of such study, however, is not his biography. It should be pursued in the works which document the Prophet's actions and sayings, relate them to one another, and deduce whether a certain action is obligatory, recommended, permissible, discouraged, or prohibited. A definitive speech. Starting from Makkah on the 8th day of Dhul Hijjah, the Prophet at midday mounted his she-camel and went to Mina, where he spent the night. In the morning, he prayed Fajr in Mina before leaving for Arafat after sunrise. At Arafat, he delivered his major speech, still mounting his she-camel. A man with a loud voice called Rabi'a ibn Umayyah ibn Khalaf stood next to the Prophet's camel, repeating every sentence the Prophet said, so that all those who were with the Prophet heard everything. The Prophet's speech that day was the highlight of his pilgrimage, outlining the nature of Islamic society. As usual, his speech began with the praise and glorification of God. The Prophet then went on to say, "People, listen to me as I explain to you, for I do not know whether I will ever meet you again in this place after this year. People, do you know in what month, day, and city you are?" They said, "We are on a sacred day, in a sacred month, in a sacred city." He said, "You know then that your blood, property, and honor are forbidden you till you meet your Lord in the same way as the sanctity of this day of yours, and this month of yours, In this city of yours, you will certainly meet your Lord, and he will certainly question you about what you do. Have I delivered my message? They answered, Yes. He said, My Lord, bear witness. He who holds something belonging to another for safekeeping must give it back to the person to whom it belongs. All usury transactions which have been made in the past days of ignorance are hereby abrogated. You may claim only your capital, neither inflicting nor suffering any injustice. God has decreed that no usury is permissible. The first usury transactions I abrogate are those of my uncle Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib. All cases of vengeance killings are hereby waived. The first case of killing I thus waive is that of Amir ibn Rabia ibn al-Harith. Have I delivered my message? They said, You have. He said, My Lord, bear witness. People, the postponement of sacred months is an excess of disbelief, a means by which those who disbelieve are led astray. They declare this postponement to be permissible in one year and forbidden in another, in order to conform outwardly to the number of months which God has made sacred, and thus they make allowable what God has forbidden. Time has now been set back in its original fashion, which it had when God created the heavens and the earth. The number of months in the sight of God is 12, out of which 4 are sacred. 3 consecutive ones and a single one, Dhul Qada, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and Rajab, which falls between Jumada and Shaban. This is the ever-true law of God. Do not, then, sin against yourselves with regard to these months. When I am gone, do not revert to disbelief, killing one another. Have I delivered my message? They answered, You certainly have. Continuing his speech, he said, My Lord, be my witness. People, you have an obligation towards your womenfolk, and they have an obligation towards you. It is their duty not to allow into your homes anyone whom you dislike without your permission. Should they do that, God has permitted you to desert them in bed, then to beat them without any severity. Should they desist, they have the right to be provided with food and clothing in fairness. Your womenfolk are in your custody. They are helpless. You have taken them on the basis of a pledge to God, and they are lawful to you with God's word. Fear God, then, in your treatment of women, and be kind to them. Have I delivered my message? They replied, Yes, indeed. He said, My Lord, be my witness. People, the believers are brothers. It is illegal for anyone to take the property of his brother unless it is given without any coercion. People, your Lord is one and your Father is one. All of you are the children of Adam, and Adam was created from dust, peace be upon him. The most noble among you is the most God-fearing. No Arab enjoys any privilege over a non-Arab except through the fear of God. Have I delivered my message? They answered, Yes, you most certainly have. He said, My Lord, be my witness. People, Satan has given up any hope of being worshipped in this land of yours. He is satisfied, however, to be obeyed in matters which you consider trivial. Guard yourselves against him, lest he corrupts your faith. I have left with you what should keep you safe from going astray should you hold fast to it. It is something clear and simple, God's book and the sunnah of his prophet. You will be questioned about me. What will you say? They said, We bear witness that you have delivered your message complete, and you have discharged your mission and given good counsel. The prophet pointed his forefinger at the sky and lowered it to point to the people, saying all the time, My Lord, bear witness, my Lord, bear witness. The prophet then said, Let those who are present communicate what I have sent to those who are not with us today. It may happen that those who come to know of it in this way may understand it better than some of those who have listened to it. Thus, the prophet concluded his major speech. 5 principles. This memorable speech outlines 5 basic principles of the Islamic program of action. 2 of these work on the level of the individual, and 3 relate to the structure of Islamic society. Islam molds the character of the Muslim on the basis of 2 fundamental principles. First, Islam severs all ties which a Muslim has with ignorance or jahiliyyah, its idols, practices, financial dealings, usury transactions, and so on, because the adoption of the religion of Islam means a start of a new life for a Muslim which is completely divorced from the erroneous ways of the past. The second principle is to guard against all forms of sin. The effects of sin are far more serious than the danger presented by any enemy in battle. All catastrophes in this life are caused by our sins, which also lead us to suffer in the hereafter. The Prophet also made it clear that he did not mean by sin the sinking back into idolatrous worship. Any intelligent person who comes to know of the faith based on God's oneness will never degrade himself to the extent of willingly accepting and claiming that God has partners. Yet, the evil one does not give up his attempts to seduce people into committing sins in order to lead them further astray. The Prophet has also outlined 3 basic principles on which Islamic society is founded. The first is the tie of Islamic brotherhood, which molds the proper relationship between all Muslims. It is this brotherhood which makes every Muslim a patron of every other Muslim, giving him whatever help he can. The second principle is supporting the weak, so that their weakness does not make the whole society vulnerable. One should note in particular how the Prophet stressed the importance of being kind to women, since they are the weaker element in society. The third principle is the cooperation between an Islamic government and the members of an Islamic society to achieve the proper implementation of Islamic law, which works for the removal of all evil from society and its replacement with what is good. The total sum of these 5 principles is to translate the Quran and the Sunnah into practice. Hence, the Prophet did not forget to enjoin his companions to hold fast to them and implement them in their lives. Short as it was, the Prophet's speech included all the principles which are needed for the molding of the perfect believer in Islam and the perfect Muslim society. Hence, the Prophet was keen to impress on his followers that he had delivered his message and discharged his mission. He repeatedly prayed to God to be his witness. The Prophet's pilgrimage was his only performance of this religious duty since it was decreed by God. When he completed that pilgrimage, the Muslims were able to follow his practical guidance in all aspects of Islam. There were several indications which suggested that the Prophet's mission was approaching its end. So far, the Muslims were used to the fact that God's messenger lived among them as one of them, receiving guidance directly from God, explaining to them the right course to follow in any problem they might have. To them, the prospect of continuing an Islamic life without the Prophet was something they could not contemplate. Yet, the Prophet realized that was inevitable. He therefore painstakingly tried to prepare them for that eventuality. Indicating the inevitable. We have seen how the Prophet bade farewell to his companion, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, whom he appointed as governor of Yemen. When Mu'adh was on the point of departure from Medina, the Prophet told him that he might not see him again, though he might pass by his mosque and his grave. That piece of warning came only a short while before the Prophet embarked on his journey of pilgrimage. When he delivered his very important speech on the day when all pilgrims must be in attendance at Arafat, he started by saying to his companions, "Listen to me, for I do not know whether I will ever meet you again in this place after this year." That speech of the Prophet, which highlighted the main principles of Islam and the foundation of Islamic society, was a farewell speech stressing the values in violation of which no Islamic society can retain its Islamic character. After every point the Prophet made in his speech, he asked his companions, "Have I delivered my message?" This was the attitude of a man, a prophet who understood well the value of his message and was keen to deliver it complete to the people so that they might implement it in practical life. When they declared that he certainly had delivered his message, the Prophet repeatedly asked God to be his witness to that. If the message was duly delivered, and if that message or the faith it represented was complete, then the mission of the Prophet was over. Hence, when the Prophet recited to his companions during his pilgrimage the verse which was revealed to him, "This day I have completed your religion for you, and perfected my grace to you, and approved Islam as your religion," the significance was absolutely clear. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was perhaps the companion of the Prophet endowed with the keenest perception, was in tears when he listened to the Prophet reciting this verse. Asked by his colleagues why he was crying, he answered, "Nothing comes after perfection but imperfection." One can imagine that he sensed that the Prophet's life was drawing to a close. Indeed, several statements of the Prophet and relevant incidents suggested to those who had keen insight that a great and noble life was approaching its end. When the Prophet went for stoning at Aqaba, he said to the great crowd of pilgrims surrounding him, "Learn from me your rights, for I may never offer the pilgrimage again after this year." Moreover, the surah entitled Victory was revealed to the Prophet on the second day of his stay at Mina. It may be rendered in English as follows: When God's help and victory come, and you see people embracing God's faith in groups, glorify your Lord, praise Him, and ask His forgiveness, for He is much forgiving. Two of the most learned companions of the Prophet, Umar ibn al-Khattab and Abdullah ibn Abbas, the Prophet's cousin, realized that the revelation of the surah was an announcement to the Prophet that his time on earth would soon be over. Another indication of the approaching event took place earlier that year. In Ramadan, the Prophet used to stay in his mosque for 10 days, which he dedicated totally to worship. Every year, he received the angel Gabriel in the month of Ramadan, and they recited the Quran. This time, the Prophet stayed in his mosque for 20 days in Ramadan, and the two of them recited the full text of the Quran twice. When we look at the situation in Arabia at the time when the Prophet offered his pilgrimage, we find that he was able to establish a solid base for Islam from which it could spread its message to the rest of mankind. The Prophet was keen to indicate to his companions that Arabia must always remain the base of Islam. It is by the grace of God that it has continued to be so ever since. By the time all these indications were pointing to the approaching end of the Prophet's mission, the whole of Arabia was loyal to Islam. While it was true that many parts of the Arabian Peninsula underwent that great transformation from its old pagan faith to Islam, the most monotheistic of all religions, the Prophet realized that a change in reverse was highly unlikely. Certain factors and circumstances may lead to a renunciation of Islam, as indeed happened after the Prophet's death, but such challenges were bound to end in failure. Once the straightforward faith based on God's oneness took its hold in the hearts of people, it could never be easily renounced. The Prophet's mission was approaching its end because the message of Islam embodied in God's revelations was conveyed by him to the Arabs, and through them to the rest of mankind. The establishment of the geographical base of Islam in Arabia ensured that Islam was to remain forever an active force in man's world. Hence, the task of the messenger was completely fulfilled. After the pilgrimage. When the Prophet had completed his pilgrimage, it was time for him to go back to Medina. He returned with the Muhajirin and the Ansar, while people from other tribes went to their various places. The fact that he had delivered his message did not mean that the Prophet was to lead a comfortable and luxurious life. He went to Medina in order to resume his duty as an advocate of Islam, who called on people to embrace it. He went back to teach that the duty of striving for God's cause, for instance jihad, does not end until the last breath of life. If we imagine an ordinary leader returning to his capital after undertaking a journey which reassured him that the unity which he managed to achieve in his formerly badly divided country was absolutely solid, and the philosophy he has been preaching has taken its hold on the minds and hearts of his people, we are certain to have in mind a happy picture of a happy leader. He would certainly look at his past efforts crowned with that unity with satisfaction. We can also be certain that his first priority would be to consolidate that achievement before setting himself any further objectives. When the Prophet returned to Medina after his journey of pilgrimage, he was in a far better situation than that of our imaginary leader. He had certainly established a very solid base for Islam, yet he recognized that the new faith needed time to deepen its roots in the life of Arabian society. Hence, a consolidation effort was needed. The Prophet, however, was no ordinary national leader. Indeed, he was not a national leader at all. He was a messenger of God and the head of a state which prided itself on having an ideological foundation. Considerations of race, nation, language, or color were not given any value in that state. At the same time, the Prophet realized that his message was not aimed at any particular nation. It was God's message to mankind. Hence, all people were addressed by that message. The Muslim nation, whether Arab or not, is placed in trust of that message, and it is responsible for making it known to all people. While compulsion is totally rejected as a means of converting people to Islam, informing others of the message God wants them to adopt and implement remains a duty of the Muslim nation. This is the fundamental factor which made the Prophet's return to Medina after his pilgrimage totally different from the return of a highly successful leader from a journey in which he takes stock of his achievements. The Prophet realized that a state founded on faith will always be exposed to a threat from any major power which finds that faith a threat to its supremacy. The danger was certain to be much greater considering the fact that there were common borders between the Muslim state and the Byzantine Empire. Hence, he wanted to demonstrate to that empire that the old image of a weak tribal society in Arabia had been shattered forever. For a few weeks after the Prophet's return to Medina, the Muslims lived in peace. That was a period of calm, the like of which had not been seen in Arabia for many years. Soon, however, that air of peace was shattered. Farwa ibn Umar al-Juthami was a governor of Ma'an, the south of the present-day Jordan, appointed by the Byzantine emperor. Farwa, however, received the message of Islam and recognized its truthfulness. He sent a message to the Prophet informing him of his acceptance of Islam. His action, however, infuriated the Byzantine emperor, who ordered an army to subdue Farwa and arrest him. The Byzantine army did just that, and soon Farwa found himself in prison. After a summary trial, he was sentenced to death. Shortly afterwards, he was executed near a spring known as Afra in Palestine. He was crucified and left on the cross for a long time in order to dissuade others from following his example. It is reported that when he was about to be executed, his final words were an appeal to those who were present to convey to the Muslims that he sacrificed his life willingly for the cause of Islam. The choice of an army commander. The Prophet viewed the execution of Farwa as an act of provocation which could not be allowed to pass without the Muslim state making its presence felt. He therefore ordered that an army be raised under the command of Osama ibn Zayd ibn Haritha, a youth of 17 whom the Prophet loved dearly. The Prophet's choice of commander served several purposes. For one thing, Osama was a talented young man. There was bound to be in his army a large number of capable soldiers, much older than him and highly qualified to be commanders themselves. The Prophet wanted it to be known that under Islam, seniority of age or position counted for nothing. Ability was the only criterion which distinguished people. Moreover, Osama's father, Zayd ibn Haritha, was formerly a slave owned by the Prophet's first wife, Khadija. When she was married to the Prophet 15 years before he received his first revelations, she gave him Zayd as a gift. He set him free, but Zayd stayed with him until he was killed in the first encounter between the Muslim state and the Byzantine Empire. He was the first commander of the Muslim army which fought that battle. The choice of Osama as the commander of the army on this occasion was a fresh demonstration that under Islam, a son of a former slave was worthy of being commander of an army in which many people of noble birth were ordinary soldiers. Indeed, a great number of the Prophet's companions, from the Muhajirin and the Ansar, volunteered to take part in that expedition. Although the hardcore of the Muslim nation, that is, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, who had molded their lives in accordance with Islam, were fully aware that the old distinctions between master and slave, aristocracy and commoners were totally destroyed by Islam. A fresh practical demonstration of their destruction was needed in order to instill the notion of equality of all Muslims in the minds of those who had only recently adopted Islam. For Osama to be a commander of an army in which the most senior of the Prophet's companions were soldiers was one such practical demonstration. It has already been mentioned that Usama's father was the first commander of the Muslim army which fought the first encounter between the Muslim state and the Byzantine Empire. By his choice of commander, the Prophet perhaps wanted to pass a message to the Byzantines that the Muslim state wanted to avenge its military defeat in that encounter. Yet the fact that Usama was so young led a number of the companions of the Prophet to question his appointment. The Prophet was informed of this when he was ill. He went out to the mosque with a band round his head and addressed the people. After praising God and glorifying Him, he said, "People, let this army of Usama fulfill its mission. I know you are questioning his appointment as you had questioned the appointment of his father as commander. He, Usama, is a worthy commander, as his father was also worthy of his command." The Prophet gave Usama very clear instructions. He was to take his army into the heartland of Palestine, reaching the area of Al-Baqa and Darum. This meant that Usama's mission was one of demonstration of strength, aiming at making the Byzantine rulers think twice before embarking on any provocative adventure against the Muslim state. Another purpose was to reassure the Arabian tribes in the border area that the Muslim state did not look at its mighty neighbor with any feeling of awe. They were to be reassured that by embracing Islam, they did not expose themselves to any great danger from the Byzantine Empire. It was only a matter of a few days until the army was raised. All the earlier Muhajirin and many of the Ansar volunteered to join. Among Usama's soldiers were such great figures as Abu Bakr and Umar ibn al-Khattab. Usama's army encamped at a place called Al-Jurf, a few miles from Medina, waiting for the volunteers to get ready. Its departure, however, was delayed by an unexpected and unwelcome event.